First thing I want to do is just introduce the panelists to you. We have Alex
Avdichuk.
Thank you. I should have figured that out downstairs. Okay. Alex is the Supervisor of Collections and Conservation with the City of Toronto Museums and Heritage Services. She has 25 years of experience in the museum field, working primarily in collections management, though she has dabbled in public programming, curation, and exhibit design and fabrication. With a BA in Classical Art and Archaeology from the University of Ottawa and a Master of Museum Studies from the University of Toronto, Alex returned to school in mid-career to complete a diploma in Cultural Resource Management from the University of Victoria. She started her career at the Bytown Museum in Ottawa as assistant curator, followed by a decade of work with the Outdoor Architecture and Sculpture Collection of the Guild Inn in Scarborough. She began work with the City of Toronto Historical Artifact Collection in 2004, became the Supervisor of Collections in 2006. Her areas of interest include the challenges of storing archaeological collections databases, and engaging youth with artifact collections as learning tools. We have Mikael Sydor. Michael's role wave your hand as I'm reading all about you. Michael's role at ERA focuses on the documentation and conservation of historic buildings and materials. Notable projects include the masonry restoration of the King Edward Hotel, the rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of Casey House Hospice, which is winning awards all over the damn place. He is also involved in the research towards Tower neighborhood renewal. An example of this work includes the building an envelope retrofit and TCH reset project at Lawrence Horton. Prior to joining ERA, Michael worked for a research group exploring questions of digital documentation and heritage BIM integration. The architects in the room will know what that means. He has contributed to peer-reviewed papers on the topic. He holds a Master of Architecture from the University of Toronto and a BIS from Carleton University. So welcome, Michael. Finally, last but not least, is Ralph Daley. Ralph is the founding president of the Grange Community Association of Toronto, formed in 2008. The boundaries are Spadina University, East-West, and Queen College, North-South. The GCA addresses matters of planning and development, social infrastructure, and community standards as the voice of the Grange community. Ralph has led the effort to create a Grange green plan focused on new parkettes, boulevard and laneway greening, urban forest expansion, and climate change mitigation. Ralph served as citizen co-chair of the Grange Park Advisory Committee, which oversaw the $12 million, 8-year-long refurbishment of Grange Park, completed in the summer of 2017. He also sits on the Cecil Community Center Board of Management. By profession, Ralph is an aquatic research scientist who served for over 35 years in research management with the Canadian government and the United Nations. He was born in southwestern Ontario, received his MSc and PhD in aquatic ecology from Queen's University. Wow, that's quite a mix of things. and a people. So let's go. I have to say that I've had a crazy day. I was out doing a ACO preservation works, looking at an interesting building. So I came back, and all of the questions are prepared. So I just have to sit up here and read and make sure nobody kills each other. So here we go. So the first question is area of questioning is about discussion about the pieces in the exhibition. The pieces on display here represent only a small fraction of the surplus and recently deaccessioned collection of architectural fragments at the Guild Park and Garden. Alex, can you give us a brief history of the pieces on display and how they got to the Guild Inn?
Well, for anyone who's not familiar with the Guild Inn and the architectural collection there, it was started as an artist colony in the 1930s, and after the war, the owners of the property decided that they weren't really all that enthused about all these old buildings coming down, partially because they had an affinity for the art that went into the architecture. So a lot of the pieces they collected were from buildings that were being demolished that had some kind of an artistic element to it. So they tended to take the figured pieces as opposed to, the plain stone, although they did collect a lot of that as well. And for about 30 years, they collected pieces from demolished buildings. They had the advantage of having lots of money and lots of land, so the pieces were transported to their home in Scarborough, which is now an 88-acre park. and they engineered them into monuments, constructs, doorways, arches, theaters, all that sort of thing, and just placed them on the land, and it became a great tourist attraction. Of course, there was also the Guild Inn, which was a hotel, so they had sort of a ready-made audience there with the visitors to the hotel. So many of the buildings that they collected the fragments from came from downtown Toronto, because during 1950s and 1960s, there was a huge push for urban renewal, and buildings were coming down left and right. So they collected what was going to be otherwise landfill, and they erected it on their property. The pieces that are in the exhibition now come from a different variety of buildings, mostly institutional buildings, like the Bank of Toronto. The Corinthian Capitol that is on display came from the Bank of Toronto, as well as the column drums that lovely keystone of Bacchus is sitting on. The Bank of Montreal was another building. There's quite a few of the fragments from the Bank of Montreal that are currently on display at the Guild right now. What else do we have? We have the Granite Club, which still exists, but in a different building than the original building. And there's a piece from the Granite Club, as well as the Toronto Star Building, which was a lovely Art Deco building that was demolished. And there's currently a rather interesting sculptural stack of pieces from that building out at the Guild. Did I miss anything?
That's great.
I don't know.
There's been some discussion about what to do with these pieces, and by extension, other salvaged pieces of Toronto buildings. I mean, mostly we don't do this anymore, but it does happen from time to time when we do things, or we only keep pieces of buildings. Ralph, could you talk a bit about on your proposed green plan, and talk a little about using architectural fragments to animate public space?
Sure. I think you mentioned in the introduction that we've put together a Grange green plan. It's been done jointly with Joe Cressy's office, the councillor's office. It's in place, but not yet approved by council, but it will go to council in July, so it's almost certainly a reality. It's got a number of aspects to it. Green plan involves climate change mitigation. It involves an effort to look at trees in the Grange and what we can do to improve the situation. Primarily though, it's new parkettes, revitalizing parkettes, finding a way to green flanking boulevards and pinch points and corners of streets where, as you probably know, much of the land facing sidewalks running along the streets is city property, and it's capable of being transformed into something that, for public use. So it's a whole suite of greening initiatives, one element of which we propose is a linear park, which would essentially start here, run up the street, up Simcoe, across over to St. Patrick, and up St. Patrick to Dundas, and stitch together a whole series of either existing parkettes, parks like the Canada Life parkette, or new parkettes which are coming, or probably coming as a result of new developments. And the idea is to call it Relic Park, and to use the stones to run the whole distance up to Dundas as a kind of motif for the parkette, and as a way of linking things together so that it becomes apparent that it is in fact a contiguous park. It would involve additional stones. I mean, I don't know, one of the questions I have is whether there are actually stones available to be used in that kind of a purpose.
Yeah, we have about 900 or so.
Might be enough. So it's an effort to see these architectural pieces very visible in the community and used as in an artistic way and an aesthetic way and used to kind of anchor green space as it's redeveloped, going along the streets of the Grange. And that is consistent with this new TO Core program that the city has just released and is just approving, finalizing currently, which is that green space in the downtown core is at an absolute premium. And we're going to have to find every possible way to scrape and scrounge and improve the greening of our neighborhoods. Laneways is one of the key elements of the green plan, but this idea of linear parks really strikes me as a way of kind of formalizing the regreening of our streets as streets.
Today we recognize the value of all these pieces, these examples of exquisite craftsmanship and design. But 40, 50 years ago, the buildings that they came from were seen as outdated and impractical. Mikael, how can the city and heritage professionals navigate the transition period between a building being simply old and impractical versus being recognized for its cultural heritage value?
Yeah.
That is a big question, and I guess another question that's running through the back of my mind, that just as we've been talking, is like these pieces of stone came from buildings, and they were in walls, and they were off the ground, and they were protected by cornices, and placing them around in the landscape where they're sitting in snow and things all winter. I mean, are we worried about that? I mean, you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, I guess I'd love to speak to both questions.
Okay.
But no, the key word that you mentioned there is heritage value, and I think that's something that's latent in this discussion and also in sort of the discourse around what to do with buildings and how to keep the fragments and how to push that forward. But the point that I want to make with that is that there's the way we attribute a heritage value is based on a community decision to have value in it. And I think by having this exhibit put forward and recognizing the values of these pieces, moving them from being in a storage yard to out here on display, and carefully placing them to bring up a dialogue and organizing something like tonight to talk about not being just something that's left in a museum, but part of our active streets and part of a discussion. And I think that's something that if we're at the risk of outdated buildings in Toronto, that we can think of is what community attributes value to this, and how can we, as a heritage professional, as the question asks, help that community to advocate for that value, or to sort of push through and understand why that's important to them or important to another community. And then the preservation question, I think, is a neat one. But when I was at Guild Park just this past weekend, on top of the stack of the Toronto Star buildings, they have these fantastic LED flashings that follow the profile of the top of the stone, so that you're shedding water appropriately and you're protecting it, but it also has this lovely like whimsy and character to it that just increases the sense of magic that you get when you're walking through Guild Park. And furthermore, like I think the way that we contemplate matching them is a curatorial question, but again, preservation works into it.
But in 20 years, if they were parked outside, would they be degraded?
Oh, likely. Yeah. I mean, they're sitting in the ground covered by snow and ice. That's not a condition that they would have experienced in buildings.
Right.
So that I think that is something that really needs to be thought through in this process. But just sitting here thinking about all these things sitting out in the lawn, and you take like something that was carved to be seen. It's kind of interesting, but we don't do that anymore. We try to keep them in buildings, but we now have this massive 900-piece collection.
Yeah. But you have to understand,
What about building them into new buildings?
the other option for these stones is essentially landfill. That's what would have happened to them if Spencer and Rosa Clark hadn't collected them. And ultimately, because we have 900 pieces of stone that we have nowhere for them to be, because there's been massive redevelopment on the property, and we need to move that stone somewhere. Somewhere costs money. Moving them costs money. So the only other option, if we can't find a use for these, is unfortunately landfill or shoreline stabilization. So it's a question of, is putting it in a place where people can enjoy it for maybe 20 years a better option than dumping it off the edge of the bluffs?
I think there's intelligent ways too of siting it, like having it up off the ground, or having I noticed the temple building sort of on the front lawn. It's the one of the big red sandstone carvings. The middle stone that has sort of a swag bow on it is face bedded, which means that the stone was taken from the orientation that it was stuck in the ground and flipped upright for them to carve it. And that means that it's spalling off, like the layers of stone that had accumulated are flaking off the front of it. And if that stone, when it, as an example, were to be laid flat on its side, it would be a lot more durable. And I think that could be a consideration.
I mean, these are kind of curatorial questions, but I think we need to think about these things, because, you know, I mean, 40, 50 years ago it was landfill. Now we look at these things and we think these are really special and they're important to us, and we're really glad that they were saved. But let's not put them in a position that ultimately doesn't save them. I guess that's where I'm going with that
But
thought.
as much as we hate to think about it, because we're all here because we love heritage and we think it should be preserved, it comes down to money. And anybody who tells you any different is lying to you. And if you don't have the money, then it just isn't going to happen. So, and an interesting part of the story, you're talking about the temple building construct. If anyone is familiar with this, it used to stand at Queen and Bay Street, and it was the original home of the International Order of Foresters. And it has a lovely carved temple building across the bottom. And it's in horrible condition. But part of the reason it's in horrible condition is because of attempts at preservation. So in the late 1970s, when it started to spall, because it's red sandstone, and red sandstone in the Canadian climate is never a good idea, they attempted to consolidate the stone. So they coated it. And all the coating did was it trapped all the moisture in that stone, so that when it got cold, as it does in Canada, what happened was that moisture froze and it started to pop off all of that sandstone. So in the attempt to preserve it, they actually hastened its deterioration. So that is unfortunate, but true. So you do have to be very cognizant that a lot of the materials have issues, like whether or not they've been, bedded correctly, and whether or not there's inherent vice in the stone. Are there impurities that are going to cause it to deteriorate more rapidly than if it were another block of stone? Is it going to be set somewhere where it's going to be exposed to road salt and moisture? Is there wicking moisture up because the base is made out of a porous material, or is it going to be able to shed water? All of these considerations have to be taken into account when you decide to put the stone somewhere. Some of those considerations were taken into account when they were put out at the Guild, but not all of them. So there has been extensive work on the collection over the years to correct a lot of the mistakes that were made by earlier generations in order to preserve that collection. And anything that we do with what's left, the 900, we would have to take those same considerations into account before we decided where they were going to go or how we were going to mount them.
But if we had the money, would you agree to putting the stones along the streets northward here?
Oh, in a heartbeat.
Glad I asked that question.
Don't get me wrong, I mean, I'd love to see all this, especially repatriated to the city, but it just, let's not be doing it in a way that's not going to be helpful. So the next area of questions is heritage conservation in Toronto today. So that might get us into some interesting stuff. It's a good thing I'm not on the panel. So here's the question for all three panelists. How would you briefly describe the current state of heritage conservation in Toronto?
I'll
You
jump
go.
in first.
Go.
No, I feel it's my privilege as a young professional to come at this with naivety and optimism. But in my 5 years working in the city, I've noticed that there's definitely a broadening definition of what is heritage. It's not just old stone buildings that are the nicest of the nice in the city and we need to preserve them. It's understanding that there's an entire fabric that backs up the city and that there's increasing voices that are advocating for that, or advocating for the plain, the humble, but also that reinforces the city that we understand and its history. And I think there's also the closening gap of heritage, of looking at modern buildings, so modern, like built say 40 years ago. And I think one of the interesting examples is the Bank of Toronto building that a bunch of the fragments are in the exhibit here and also in Guild Park, that was demolished to make way for the TD Center, which is a designated heritage building. And there are sort of a couple of interesting layers on top of that. But I'm actually, can I throw the question back to you?
No, you don't ask me. I'm not allowed to answer any of these questions. I may have something to say. Anyways, okay. The question was to all three of you.
I would answer the question in, it's better than it was, but not as good as it needs to be. So there have been a lot of improvements. There've been a lot of improvements in legislation, but there's also been a lot of improvements in attitude and what constitutes history, absolutely, and what is heritage, what should be preserved. But if you look at people's attitudes towards old buildings, you go to Europe, this is the classic example, you go to Europe and everybody gawks at the old buildings. You come to Toronto and everyone looks at the Sky Dome. Not exactly the same kind of thing, but there's a great potential for tourism for nice old buildings. My office currently sits in Liberty Village, and there's a lot of nice old buildings in Liberty Village, and people want to be in nice old buildings. People want to work in nice old buildings. They don't want them to have a condo slapped on the top of them. They want to have interesting spaces to work so that they can be creative and they can, have a nice atmosphere, even if that means your office doesn't have air conditioning. Ask me how I know. It says a lot for the generations that now want to work. They don't want to work in the sterile office tower. They want to work in the funky wood building or the reconverted warehouse building. And there's a lot of demand for that kind of office space. And I think the city's doing a real disservice if they let that go.
All right, your turn.
I probably don't even know how to spell the word heritage, so I'm not really one to be speaking it. I mean, my background is not in this realm at all. I will say that from the community association point of view, I can detect over the last 6 years or so a much more serious respect for heritage issues. There tended to before to be, just throw the building away. We want something new, something that's not ugly. And I think that's changing dramatically. And it's strengthened strongly by the Queen Street Heritage Preservation Program. So I think as you were saying, that it's getting better. But we, as laymen in the community, I don't think we're getting very good guidance as to how to view the whole heritage realm of issues. And professionals could do a lot better job of strengthening public understanding of the heritage realm.
That's an interesting thing to flip back to the president of the local Toronto branch. We do a lot, but we're a group like you. I mean, we're people working at night in our computers in between all our other responsibilities. But there's a lot out there if you go looking for it. I mean, Heritage Toronto runs wonderful walking tours. Toronto Society of Architects does great walking tours. People are after us to do walking tours. We don't think we need to do walking tours. Everybody else is doing them. There's a lot out there, but the questions are I think complicated in some ways, they appear complicated to lay people, but they're not. I mean, ultimately, I think it's about community value, right? And it built into heritage legislation is valued by community, which, you can hang a lot of stuff on.
You sure can.
And ultimately, that's the decision. And it doesn't say, thou shalt only value architectural masterpieces, or thou shalt only value, it gives you quite a list, quite a large list of things that would constitute under the category of cultural value. And so that, I think that is getting better, the definitions are broadening, is, that's part of, and it makes it, there's a big debate about, is it okay to be listing the things that aren't the pretty ones, because they play a role.
That's really it. Can I make a comment?
Yeah. I'm getting to these questions down here, but these questions are designed to pull that discussion out. So we're like in Toronto, a common approach to conservation has been for the developer to agree to incorporate the facade of an old building into a new structure, or sometimes even to take apart the facade. This is a long question, so just bear with me. Even to take apart the facade, then rebuild it as part of the new structure. There's been a lot of criticism of this technique, sometimes called facadism, or more recently, urban taxidermy, written by the great Robert Alsop. I married the great Robert Alsop. In Now magazine. So what are your thoughts about facadism, urban taxidermy? Is there a better alternative? From the community perspective, is it better to preserve the facade of a small part of a heritage-built structure than to lose the whole thing? And what about the other aspects of our heritage that are not captured in architectural expression? For example, historic patterns of use, exemplified in districts like Toronto's Yonge Street. ACO Toronto has nominated Yonge Street for Canada's top 10 endangered places. So we'll see if we get that dubious distinction. So go for it. What do you think?
Go ahead.
Yeah, you had something you wanted to say. Get to it.
It was related back to the way in which we as a community association get directed to heritage issues, and that's almost always through a new development. And so you end up in an adversarial situation immediately, and for the layman, there's no context, there's no broad general understanding of principles of heritage to help guide you. And so you end up in this we-they mindset, which I think is awkward at times. And worse, it sometimes leads to the city being viewed as trying to ram through buildings that aren't truly heritage buildings as an excuse to say no to the development. So it's almost a kind of, it's a way of overstating the heritage value of something as an indirect way of saying no for other reasons on developments. And I find that really awkward. There's one right now up in Dundas where the city's asking for heritage listing for a couple of buildings, which the vast majority of us don't see any heritage value to at all. And yet, if they did what they are proposing, it would terminate the building. It would make sure that the building never got built. And there are people saying that's what they're trying to do. They're not really trying to save those buildings for heritage purposes. They're trying to stop the next door development. And I find that a kind of awkward diversion of the overall process, and it diminishes heritage.
I think Sean McAuliffe was writing about that recently.
Well, I have to say, I absolutely love the term urban taxidermy. I think it does say exactly what is happening in such a unique way. But I'm going to have everybody think about it this way. urban taxidermy, as defined, is when you take a piece of a building and you put another building in it, and you stuff it with another building, essentially, correct?
Yep.
Well, I challenge you to think about adaptive reuse of historic buildings as this very same thing. Because once you have a building that was built for a specific purpose, say a bank, and then you turn it, you keep the building complete, but you turn it into retail. Didn't you just do the same thing? Didn't you just stuff a heritage building full of something that it wasn't? That, to me, is the exact same thing. It's urban taxidermy. So you just still have the shell. It may be an intact shell, but it's still a shell. So the only way that you can really save a heritage building is to never change it. And I don't think that's right either. For those of you who have been out at the Guild and you've seen what has been done with the pieces of the building, that's more, I look at that, what was done is not really saving the building, saving the pieces in a way that, from my museum background, is like putting up a dinosaur skeleton. You don't have all the bits, but you have enough to get a sense of what it looked like. That's another preservation, strategy. It's valid. It can tell you that there were these really nice buildings that stood somewhere sometime, and then they're not there anymore. But really, to look at the preservation of parts of buildings or whole buildings, if they're not doing exactly what they were built to be originally, we're not preserving them. We're just preserving a shell.
I think it's an interesting question about like what the positive values of adaptive reuse versus ripping off a facade and putting a bank behind it, and I think it's about the approach that we have to that thing. It's like, would it be appropriate to make sure that we're still making munitions in Liberty Village? Probably not. And from a preservation or conservation question, I think it's a really exciting thing that you can have sort of a new use, and you can continue to reinterpret the values that are represented by that shell or by the pieces of it that we choose to keep, and who we're keeping that for, whether it's sort of the greater public good to walk around in a well-preserved, beautiful neighborhood and enjoy that streetscape, or if it's for some other development purpose. But I want to get to discussing this with you about just sort of the community activism portion of it, and the agency that you have to sort of stand in front of the city and say, no, like, we find this important, we think your arguments are super valid for this piece of architecture, or maybe not. Maybe it is to push through and say, well, actually, we think you're misusing this. We think like this business owner that we know wants to put on a third floor addition shouldn't have it listed. And I think you're in a position where representing the community around you, you have so much say in how that can happen. And also, frustratingly hitting up against walls, but. Of course.
But, let me just take that question back a bit, because I was involved in a case in Muskoka where we're dealing with a place that had been a portage site for thousands of years, and had certainly been everybody's favorite waterfall, everybody's favorite spot for 100 years. Lots of photographs, lots of people there. I mean, it's like a huge amount of history. It was just a rock and a beach, but it was what happened there was what gave the place meaning. And so the Conservation Review Board agreed to that designation. And so I think what we're seeing in when people are saying, well, that's not really heritage, is when you're saying that, you're looking at heritage through a very specific lens, that it has to be a fine building. It may be that the value of these places the city is trying to preserve is because it's how those buildings interact with everything around it, and the historic patterns of use of the place, which is quite different than land use planning, like whether it's commercial, residential, but just how all these things are interdependent, and you can work with that in using a heritage district tool and kind of a holistic measure, which heritage can be looked at as in in many different ways, and we're sort of entering into this world of there are other things we value about buildings besides architecture and the physical piece of it, and it's how they work in cities. So, that question is sort of to get into that. So, like on one level, you think that's just a dumb old ordinary building that nobody cares if it comes or goes, but somebody cares because perhaps what they feel that what's being put in place to replace it is destructive and is negative. And so we ought to have planning tools that deal with that question. We don't. So, which is why, and there is I think there's an aspect of heritage that is appropriately applied in that way, but it's a kind of new realm.
The problem with this particular example is that what it was to be replaced with when those buildings were torn down was a park. A park right up at Dundas and Mikael. And so it's, it makes it even way more difficult. But you're right, the reaction of the community to the city's proposal to designate, or list rather, it was based on the building. It was not based on the history of the building or the context, other than, in fact, half the building's gone. It was torn away 35 years ago, so it's only half a building. And it's in an area where everything's changing. So it's either you would argue, I want to keep these disgusting old buildings because they're the only thing left, and that's kind of like a sort of penalty to the community, or you argue that.
There's a whole lot of it depends in this. I mean, and
I'm oversimplifying it for the sake of it.
So you're always going to get people that have drunk the heritage Kool-Aid, and I like to think that we are all those people. I know I am. But my work in museums for the last 25 years has taught me one thing, and that there will be a certain community that will agree with what you're doing, and then there will be a whole bunch of people that you cannot convince with a gun to their head. Take, for instance, my sister and I. Grew up in the same household, nature or nurture, whatever, we have the same childhood, we played with the same toys, we, had all these same experiences. We both had the opportunity when we were teenagers to go to London, England. We didn't go at the same time, we went separately. But we both had a very different impression. I loved it. I was looking at all the old buildings, I was entranced with the history, I had the time of my life. My sister summed up her trip to London with, "It's old and dirty." But that's the thing. There are people who, no matter what, you can't convince them that a heritage building is going to be important. But that doesn't mean it's not, because there are people that it is very important to. So that's where we have to strike a balance with conservation. And I'm not suggesting that just because, we're not preserving, we shouldn't preserve any building because you'll never be able to preserve it properly. You have to know your audience, and you have to know what's possible. Do you have the money to do it? Do you have the support to do it? And if so, then do it, because it's worth doing. It's always worth doing. But you're not always going to have all those factors in play.
Okay. Is there anything more on that question? I'm going to pin you because ERA is asked to do a lot of this work, and you are experts at rehabilitating pieces of buildings and all the technical challenges there are in keeping this much of a building and building an underground parking. There's a lot involved in that. So,
I think I want to, aside from criticizing Toronto's system, I think I want to bring up maybe a good example and sort of talk about how perhaps we can remove some of that obfuscation of how heritage happens, and it's the inventory work that the City of Hamilton has engaged in, and basically what they've noticed in their planning department and their heritage department, which are a lot more integrated than ours, that there's going to be a huge building boom in downtown Hamilton in the next 10 years. And they wanted to get ahead of it, to understand what they think is sort of the aspects that they want you to keep, to a huge community consultation and make sure what the expert planners think matches what the community thinks. And then put all the guidelines out in front of everybody, in front of the developers, in front of the community, to say this is what we think is going to happen next. And to sort of go through this process, they went and looked at every single property in their downtown core, some 10,000, or sorry, 7,000 buildings, and made a little assessment saying this building is representative of this era, it has these features, and then gave them a qualifier saying, like, we think this is the absolute landmark that we want to preserve. We think this one's supporting, but it could have some modifications. We think this one is fabric, and if you respect the scale and the materials, then it's probably okay. Or this one we think is just total junk. Tear it down for whatever you want to do. And I think this is something that we can look to that's available under the same regulatory framework in our city, to say that we value this, and this is the resources that we want to put into shaping our community and shaping our city. I'm really curious to see what happens in downtown Hamilton in the next 10 years.
Yeah, you're already moving into the question, the next group of question, or next question is this notion of planning for the future. And moving forward, what steps can we take to conserve Toronto's built heritage while we're still meeting the needs of a growing and increasingly diverse city? One of the things that is on the table, and I think our heritage staff are struggling with how to make work, is councillors who are just fed up with kind of things going down in the middle of the night that that everybody thought was there for a while, and wanting the once and for all survey of the city to happen. And can we go out there and survey and determine what's heritage and what's not,
Be safe.
Can we do that? I mean, is it possible? Would we ever get it right? I mean, there's a lot in that. I mean, I think it's worth trying. I mean, and certainly moving into that would be better than where we are now, where stuff that everybody does value hasn't been looked at yet, where the inventory is way behind what is easily recognized as having heritage value, and then the more subtle things and the kind of things that are about other kinds of values. Those, I mean, it sounds as the Hamilton process isn't picking those up as well. I mean, I don't know, but anyways, some thoughts on that as like this notion of a citywide survey. Could we ever get there? What I think. At one point, there was a suggestion, I think from Michael McClellan, that every time a developer does a proposal, that they have to come in with a heritage impact statement, and actually do the homework to find out if there is something on that site that we should be worrying about, and not and not sort of run away if the city staff haven't managed to ding it yet. Then we're off scot-free. Well, that doesn't always work out that way. So I mean, thoughts. You want to explore that a little bit, all of you?
I totally want to explore that. And I think the interesting thing about doing a survey and doing an inventory is that it's acknowledging that heritage values change. Like our perceptions of things, it depends, but it also depends on the community that's surrounding it, or the community 15 years down the road that has decided that actually this is a little more valuable to us than that. And I think it alone, like assessing something, is never enough. It's being involved in that process and continually updating and continually having community groups or having experts come in and help along that process.
I think the changes to the OMB legislation has helped a great deal, or will help a great deal, since everybody knows that just sending something to the OMB was basically an excuse for the developers to get their own way. And at least now there's a process where there can be real input from city council and from the communities to say why these things are valued and why we should not necessarily just rip up everything and build condos. And I think it'll be a while before we see the fruits of that particular change, but hopefully it's going in a positive direction.
Heritage appeals are still the OMB though.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, it's gonna take a while. We can live in hope.
Well, from the community point of view, I think we're forced to be reactive all the time, driven by specific proposals from specific locations. We spent a huge amount of effort at the OMB, almost never on heritage issues, almost always on height or sort of inappropriateness of the new function of the new building. And so it's, I mean, as a community association, we're in there we're weighing in there with our opinions. I'm not sure that they do much good at all. And I'm not sure that the new process that directs more of the decision-making within the city is going to be all that much better anyway. The real problem we have is that we're, as a community, as representatives of a community, we are volunteers. We are not probably fully representative of the community. It still is populated, the community association is populated with people who are interested in being engaged. And they're not necessarily typical. In fact, some people would argue they're atypical. And so you, there's an issue there that needs to, we need to address whether the community really can be effectively represented by a community association. There's nothing better that I can think of, but it would be, if I were permitted one gripe, it would be that the planning department of the city has said, that the planners have said directly to me repeatedly, we do not represent you. We do not represent the citizens of this city. We represent the planning department. So if you want to make a point about your view of the situation from a community point of view, you have to make it, because we're not going to make it for you. And sometimes it overlaps with the issues, but most of the time it doesn't. And that's pretty awkward way to
But community voices have had a lot of power. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes the smallest community voices can have the greatest impact. We just have to look at the fact that we still have an old city hall. We still have a Fort York. These things were preserved because the community got up and said, no, we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to take this as far as we can take this. And, sometimes the good guy wins.
Yeah, sometimes the good guy loses.
Or in Canada, we have the great Canadian compromise on anything.